with answering questions regarding the classroom material, we can also discuss homework solutions. So with that announcement, I shall share the screen. Okay, so I hope all of you are able to see my screen. See the paper that I have here. So let me get started. So ideally, the last lecture was supposed to be the last class in relation to dynamics of single rigid bodies rotating in 3D. But unfortunately, the amount of material that I had gathered for that part of the course was more than what could be accommodated over the last 1 month, and therefore we are having this special class. So today's class would start by discussing multi-body dynamics. Okay, so as per the formality, we shall briefly recap what we discussed in the previous lecture. So a substantial fraction of the previous lecture was devoted to repeating some of the stuff that I had talked about 2 lectures back, on account of the fact that the Wacom tablet messed up many things in connection with explaining the matter clearly. So but I'll recap here only the stuff that was exclusive to previous class. We talked about we revisited this problem of this rotating swash plate, and saw how the way a swash plate that is rotating results in a moment on account of centrifugal force. When the swash plate itself is spinning about its axis relative to the rotating shaft, the torque that you experience at the bearings is due to Coriolis force. So Coriolis and centrifugal force together contribute to a rate of change of angular momentum, together manifest themselves as rates of change of angular momentum, and therefore result in torque at the bearings. And then we again discuss the situation of the wobbling frisbee for the sake of clarity. And then we asked ourselves how this rotating rigid body would look like, how the angular velocity would look like in the frame of reference of the body itself, in the body fixed frame, because our Euler's equations are written in the body fixed frame, and therefore we wanted to see how that appears. And we could do that from first principles, actually without actually writing Euler's equations. But then subsequently we also wrote down the equations and solved those differential equations. So Euler's equations of a free symmetric top, Euler's equations for a free symmetric top. So we wrote that down and showed that in general, if the top is cylindrically symmetric, then there is a component that results in wobbling motion, and then there is a component that results in spinning motion. And the wobbling motion, we gave it a special name. We called it precession of the top, and the spinning motion, of course, continued to be called as a spin. And we took the example of Earth itself as such a symmetric top. Earth is not a perfect sphere, unlike what we often assume it to be, but it's slightly flattened at the poles and bulged at the equator because of centrifugal forces slightly pushing more towards the near the equator. So it is called as an oblate spheroid, and on account of that particular geometry, it's the moment of inertia along the z-axis I0z is actually greater than the moment of inertia along the about the x-axis. So therefore it satisfies the conditions for a free symmetric top, and we discussed how Earth also exhibits wobbling motion. However, there was some confusion in the symbols that I used, and I regret that unfortunately the confusion persists. The correct equation that I had to use, however, to explain this wobbling motion was the following: the relationship between the spin velocity, the absolute spin velocity of Earth as viewed from an inertial frame, which we call as omega s0, and omega s, and the relation was minus I0x divided by I0z minus I0x omega s is equal to omega s naught. Now omega s naught is the actual spin rate of Earth as we understand it, which is which has a rate of once per day, 1 revolution per day. Omega s, however, is what is called as Chandler wobble. Okay, so unfortunately, in all our previous examples, we have kept referring to omega s as spin velocity. So therefore, the example itself of a wobbling motion on part of Earth, requires us to redefine this. This is wobble as per Chandler. Okay, you can visualize this is that we drew this angular velocity vector in the body coordinate system. So we saw that the body coordinate system is spinning counterclockwise at a rate omega s. So, and in the B1 frame, the angular velocity vector is fixed, but B1 frame is rotating in the anti-clockwise sense with respect to the B frame at a rate omega s. So this vector therefore precedes about the z axis of the B frame. Okay, so therefore, if let us say this is Earth, the actual angular velocity is not in this direction, is not in the spin direction as we imagine it to be, but at a slight tilt, a very small tilt. Okay. Now, for a person sitting on Earth, let us say at this point, there are 2 points on Earth at which the linear velocities of Earth is 0. If you for a moment ignore that Earth is going around Sun and just consider that it is just a spinning object, then the linear velocity is 0 at 2 points, here and here. Okay, these are the 2 points that are situated on the instantaneous axis of rotation of Earth. So if I were to view it from the top, therefore, so somewhere near the North Pole, but not exactly at the North Pole, there is a point at which the angular velocity or the linear velocity is 0 because that point lies on that instantaneous axis of rotation. But as we discussed, this instantaneous axis of rotation also precedes about the spin axis, at the rate omega s. So this point here, therefore, will not remain the same point for all time. It slowly changes its position and describes a small circle. I think this circle, the diameter of the circle or the radius of the circle is around 1 kilometer in case of Earth. So this angle of tilt is really, really small. But nevertheless, it is not coincident with the spin. The point is not going to stay put. There's going to be a small rotational motion, and the period of that is 424 days or 427 days, as I discussed. Okay, and this phenomenon is called Chandler's wobble, and it was first predicted by Euler. And Euler's equations demonstrated that it has to be around 300 days because the geometry of the oblate spheroid results in this inertia ratio, the difference between I0z and I0x to I0x, to be around 1/300. Okay, so therefore this had to be 300 days, but what was discovered was it was 424 days. So for a long time, it turns out that astronomers actually ignored this effect, although they had made measurements which demonstrated that this point where the linear velocity is 0 is actually changing location from one day to the next. Although they had made these measurements, they ignored it because it contradicted what Euler had to say. But Chandler came along. He never knew of Euler's predictions, fortunately, so he was not scared of confronting and claiming that Euler's prediction was different, was not right. So he simply discovered this, and it turned out that the explanation for this had to do with the fact that Earth is not, it's more, the rate is a little bit lesser on account of the fact that Earth is not a rigid body, and that you have oceans and other material on the surface and some liquid core beneath the surface, both of which result in departures from the rigid body assumption for Earth, and therefore result in a different rate for the wobble compared to what was predicted by Euler. But what is worth noting is that simple rigid body, of an Earth as a solid rigid oblate spheroid gives us a very good approximation of this wobble rate, which is 300 days. Okay, the unfortunate aspect of this illustration, of this explanation, was that the name that we had used for symbols is different from what we had used in our engineering examples. We called this the spin, and we called this the spin with respect to the inertial frame. So there was no wobble. Wobble was the word we used in connection with omega z. Unfortunately, here, as per astronomers, omega s is defined as wobble. So kindly make note of this. Then we return to the problem of this spinning wheel, this wash plate, not really this wash plate, but a wash plate spinning about the shaft axis, and asked ourselves what happens when that misalignment is not there, when the angle theta is 0. And there we found that this spinning wheel could be used as what is known as a reaction wheel. So this is a very useful contraption which can be used to change the orientation of spacecrafts and maintain the orientation in space very precisely. So any small change in orientation can be corrected by spinning the reaction wheel in the opposite sense, and it works on the basis of conservation of angular momentum. Subsequently, we looked at the case when the angle theta is not 0, but rather it is 90 degrees. In other words, the spin axis of that wheel was at 90 degrees to the spin axis of that shaft, and then the shaft, then the wheel underwent what we call as gyroscopic motion. And gyroscopic motion is a term that refers to a wheel that is spinning about one axis, and that axis itself is spinning about another axis. So, and we noticed that there is this very counterintuitive phenomenon, and we also saw that examples 2 classes back, that when you have this kind of motion, there's a torque about the third axis. Okay, and the way we exploit that torque is up to us, and it was those the different ways in which we can exploit the torque that I couldn't get to in the previous lecture. So all the different ways where gyroscopic motion is put to use in order to measure angular motion, angular rate, and so on and so forth, or to apply reverse torques and so on, use as actuators and all of that. We will discuss that, as I said, in Saturday's class. So this was where I think the last example we took was, what if we do not change the angular momentum of the spinning wheel whatsoever by very cleverly mounting it, and that resulted in this structure called as a free gyro. And we saw how a free gyro can be used for brief intervals of time as a compass and guide missiles and such other devices for which the gyro is expected to maintain its orientation only for a few seconds or a few minutes. For larger durations, friction at the bearings of the gyro will cause precision, exactly as we saw in the other examples in the previous 2 lectures. So that was where we stopped. The other applications of gyro are far more important and relevant, and I have saved that for the next class, on the Saturday's class. So today we will start by talking about multi-body systems. So multi-body dynamics is of course very important. Historically, it has played a very important role, not just for engineers, but also for mathematicians and physicists. So the more famous multi-body problem is the more famous problem in multi-body dynamics is of 3 point masses that are moving under the gravitational field. Okay, so 3 planets or whatever, or 2 planets and a satellite or whatever, moving under their respective gravitational influence, and how do they move about? And this turned out to be a very big problem. Many eminent mathematicians tried their hand at solving it, and it turned out to be an intractable problem. So there are only numerical solutions to this problem, and it can lead to all sorts of crazy and interesting motion. It can lead to chaotic behavior in the motion of these 3 planets and so on. So therefore, multi-body dynamics has attracted the attention not just of mechanical engineers, but also of physicists and mathematicians. But the kind of multi-body dynamics that is of interest to us as engineers is a dynamics that would result when you interconnect rigid bodies. So an interconnection of rigid bodies results in the interconnection having its own dynamics, and so on. And studying that is of central importance to us. Why is it so important? Why do we need to study multi-body dynamics of an interconnection of rigid bodies? Well, if you go back in the first lecture, I told you that the defining feature of a mechanical engineer, just as you think of a bridge or a building when you imagine a civil engineer, when you think of a mechanical engineer, you think of a machine that does useful mechanical work. And a machine, as I said, you could break it down into three constituent elements. One is the engine, okay, device that transforms motion and forces, okay, and the third is some way to control this machine. So this device that transforms motion and forces, it's called as a mechanism, and mechanisms are essentially interconnections of rigid bodies, okay. So the centrality of therefore multi-body dynamics emerges from the centrality of mechanisms to all machines. So the examples that we have considered so far of single reaction wheels or gyroscopes and so on can at best be one element in a mechanical system. But a general mechanical system, may it be a car or an airplane or whatever else you can imagine, has any number of these that are interconnected in a very intricate manner, and in often a very clever manner, and they all require us to understand multi-body dynamics for their design and analysis. So let me take one simple example to drive home the importance of multi-body systems for mechanical engineers. And let us take the example of the powertrain of an automobile. What all do we have in the powertrain of an automobile? Just to show that how many different elements need to come together to create, to enable me to drive my car. At one end you have the engine. Okay, I'm just drawing that cylindrical bore of that engine in cross section, and at somewhere else you have the wheel. Okay, you have the rear wheels that are driven by the energy produced by this engine. In between, this wheel, for example, can move up and down. It can change its direction, and these two wheels can have different speeds, especially when you are trying to negotiate a curve. The wheel closer to the center of rotation will have lesser velocity compared to the other one. So many different kinds of motion have to be permitted for the wheel to execute while still being able to allow it to draw energy from the engine, right? So it's amazing that such a thing is even possible. But what is it that facilitates this transfer of power from the engine to the wheels? You have to remember that at its most basic level, there is just an explosion that is happening inside the engine, right? So you mix fuel and air in the right proportion, and you have a spark there, or just the heat of that heat and pressure itself results in that explosion. Whatever the case may be, that explosion has to somehow be translated to useful rotational motion of these wheels. This is how you would explain the problem to a layman, and it's amazing that it's being done. Okay, the kinds of different elements that come into play, it's worthwhile recollecting what they are. So you have the IC engine in which combustion happens. Okay, the first step is to convert this explosion into some rotational motion, because eventually we want these wheels to spin, right? We have the slider crank mechanism. Then subsequent to that, so when this is firing, the speed at which the crank is spinning is actually very, very high. So you can't use those speeds. They're in multiples of thousands of RPM. So you have to therefore have a way to reduce that speed, right? So before reducing that speed, you want to be able to have the flexibility to engage or disengage from the engine, as the case may be. And for that, you have first a clutch. And to step down the speed, okay, and make it reduce the RPM to useful levels, you have the transmission or the gearbox. Okay, then at the output of the transmission, you have, of course, a sensible, usable speed at which the shaft is turning. But then the wheels are at the back, right? You have to somehow connect a spinning shaft which is close to the engine to the axle which is so far away, and these are at different heights, not only are they at different heights, the wheels can move up and down, right? Depending on the undulations on the road. And I should be able to continue to transmit power to the wheels despite this change in its position. And therefore, I have a special connector, which is called as the universal link or the Hooke's joint. And that leads to what is known as a drive shaft, which is that long rod that connects the the universal joint near the engine to another universal joint near the axle. And finally, this universal joint doesn't directly connect to the axle. There is another system of gears which is called as a differential, and that differential permits both these wheels to have different velocities, but ensures that they both have the same mean velocity. The difference can be tuned, but the mean velocity will be the same, and that prevents the inner wheel, for example, from sliding when the automobile is trying to take a turn or something or some such thing. And therefore, you have a differential. Okay, and then differential finally leads you to the wheel. So just look at the number of different elements. Every single one of them is a rigid body. Okay, it is only this interconnection of rigid bodies that allows me to make some meaningful use of that explosion that happened at one end. Okay, that the cleverness of all of these rigid bodies and their interconnections cannot be understated. Okay, so the mechanisms are central to the working of a machine. Although the layman would probably easily appreciate the significance of an IC engine, what is under the hood in the mechanisms that convert energy there, that raw uncontrolled energy, to something that is useful, that is central to the working of a machine. And one of the defining features of mechanisms is their cleverness. Okay, somehow as mechanical engineers, we at least when I was in my undergrad, these were thought to be in a very prosaic, matter-of-fact, blasé manner. But they're extremely clever inventions, and there are many mechanisms that are that have been uploaded on YouTube. You guys can go and watch them. I have I think also a slide on which showcases a few of these mechanisms, but I don't want to show that now. Maybe if there is time at the end of the class, I will do that. You are just struck by the cleverness and the ingenuity. It's engineering at its best. Okay, if you want to convert someone into a mechanical engineer, I think the best you can do is to show him some of these mechanisms. The magic that they can, a magical effect that they can have is, in my opinion, enough for anyone to get converted to a mechanical engineer. So, therefore, mechanisms are central, and mechanisms are, of course, made of rigid bodies, and therefore, multi-body dynamics becomes very significant and relevant. So I have just taken one specific example of powertrain of an automobile, but you can imagine a robotic manipulator, and that also has an interconnection of rigid bodies, because you want multi-degree of freedom moving capability for the end effector, which is going to manipulate the part that you are going to hold, pick or place, or do whatever else. Okay, so on account of the existence of mechanisms, the centrality of multi-body dynamics for mechanical engineers becomes relevant. And given that this is so important, I think it is worthwhile to briefly and the kind of forces, the dynamic forces and so on that are generated is, of course, strongly dependent on the manner in which these different rigid bodies are connected to one another. So the way in which these are connected to one another, and that is in turn dependent on the kinematics of this of these mechanisms. Okay, so a worthwhile, a useful way to start a discussion on multi-body dynamics, therefore, is to first look at kinematic relationships that exist between rigid bodies that are connected to one another by means of different joints. Okay, so let us get started with that. Most of this lecture would focus on that. It will be discussion on kinematics, both this lecture and the next one, after which we will start to talk about the dynamics, because kinematics is central. The way these different rigid bodies move naturally will have an effect on the kinds of forces that are experienced at the joints. Okay, so we need to understand the way they move first before we go ahead with computing the forces. So let us get started with doing that. Any questions so far? Okay, so let me continue. So how can we connect? So you have multiple rigid bodies. You can think of yourself as a glorified kid who has many toys at his or her disposal. How would you want to connect them? So you connect multiple rigid bodies by means of what are known as joints. Okay, and you must have studied in your undergrad education that broadly you can classify joints as lower pair joints or higher pair joints. So the basis for this classification of joints as lower pair or higher pair is whether two interconnected rigid bodies which are connected by joints make surface contact with one another or not. So the lower pair joints make surface contact with one another. The higher pair ones either make line contact or point contact. It works. So the examples for lower pair joints, they all, of course, impose restrictions, constraints on how one rigid body can move in relation to another. That's the whole purpose of a joint. So if you have a revolute joint, for instance, then these two rigid bodies can only rotate with respect to one another about a particular axis, about a single axis. Okay, all other relative motions are arrested by this particular kind of a joint. Okay, then you have prismatic joint, which allows for linear motion between two rigid bodies. So one can translate with respect to the other along a particular direction, but not rotate, okay, or move in any other axis. Then you have the screw joint, which can undertake coupled rotation as well as displacement. When you rotate by a certain angle, it's just the name itself is enough to indicate what this can accomplish. So when you rotate by a certain angle, you move by a certain distance that is proportional to that angle of rotation. So that's called as the screw joint. Then there is the cylindrical joint, which allows for rotation about a certain axis and translation along that axis. Okay, and then there is the ball and socket joint, which we have at our shoulders, for instance. It's also called as a spherical joint. Okay, then there is the Hooke's joint, which is a very interesting. I talked about the universal joint. That's the same as the Hooke's joint. It similar to a ball and socket joint, permits rotations about two independent axes. Maybe the ball and socket joint may permit it about three independent axes. I'm not sure about that. Yeah, so the Hooke's joint permits for rotational motion about two independent axes. And then there is the, I think the last one is the planar pair, okay, which permits for translational motion about two independent axes between the two rigid bodies. Okay, these are the kinds of lower pairs that you have. And then as far as higher pairs are concerned, the most common and popular one, of course, are gears, which ensure that there is a line contact between the two rigid bodies that they are connecting. And then you can also have cams, which sometimes can have point contact, sometimes have line contact, depending on the specific design of these cams. And then you can have chain drive, belt drive. All these are considered as higher pairs. Okay, it's not clear to me why belt drives are considered higher pairs, because it's again surface contact in my books, but for some reason what the textbooks seem to say is that belt drive is also considered a higher pair. Okay, so associated with all these joints, so if I have one rigid body, I can connect it to another rigid body. So I'm the kid who is playing with these two rigid bodies, and the way I can connect one to another is by means of one or another of these joints. So associated with these joints is what is known as a joint variable. Okay, the joint variable is a variable that captures the relative position of one rigid body with respect to the other, the second one. Okay, so in case of the revolute joint, for example, the angle between these two rigid bodies will serve as the joint variable. In the case of the prismatic joint, the position along a certain linear guide way or some such thing of one rigid body with respect to another will serve as a joint variable. So these are all fairly intuitive concepts, nothing very difficult to understand. In the case of the screw joint, you only have one particular joint variable. It's either the rotation or the displacement along the axis, because the two are coupled. And that brings us to what is known as the degrees of freedom of a joint. The number of joint variables that you have is called as a degree of freedom of the joint. Of a joint. The number of joint variables, independent joint variables, is called the degree of freedom of a joint. Okay, so in case of revolute joint, I'll just write here itself, we have only one degree of freedom, right? I mean, for the joint, it permits only rotational motion about a certain fixed axis, and therefore you have only one degree of freedom for the revolute joint. For the prismatic joint, again, you have one. It permits one linear motion along one axis alone between the two rigid bodies. In case of the screw joint, one needs to be careful. There are two kinds of motion that are happening here: rotation as well as displacement along the axis of rotation. But these two are not independent. When I rotate, for example, when I turn a screw, I cannot independently control the angle by which I have turned and the depth by which it has moved in. The two are coupled. So there's only one although I can define two joint variables, the displacement and rotation, the two are not independent. They are connected to one another by the pitch of the screw. Therefore, the degrees of freedom for the screw joint is also one. Okay. Cylindrical joint, on the other hand, enables independent rotation as well as displacement along the axis. So the degrees of freedom are two. Ball and socket joint, as I said, I think it allows for rotation about 3 axes. So I'll just put 3 here. I'm not 100% sure of that. The planar pair, again 3, because it allows for changes in position along x and y and rotation about the z axis. So any motion in a plane is permitted. Okay. So a U joint, which is the Hooke's joint, has 2 degrees of freedom. It allows for rotation about 2 independent axes, and so on and so forth. Okay. So now we have understood how, given these two toys, how we can connect them, two rigid bodies. But then, when I keep connecting rigid bodies, I make what is known as a kinematic chain. Okay, a kinematic chain of rigid bodies. So the next important aspect of this connection of rigid bodies, in addition to the fact that you can connect them using one or another of these joints, is the fact that you can connect them as in broadly 2 different kinds of kinematic chains. Okay. Kinematic chains. Kinematic chain is again a concept that is easy to imagine and also relatively easy to explain, although I don't know if my definition of that would encompass all the different manifestations of the chain. Broadly, if I, let us say, take one rigid body and connect it to the second rigid body, next rigid body, by means of one link, by means of one joint, and then the second rigid body I connect to a third rigid body by means of a second joint, and so on and so forth. So I serially connect one rigid body to another, and I do not bring back any of these rigid bodies in this chain and connect them back to either the first one or the second one or any of those things, so there are no kinematic loops as they are called, then such a chain of such a kinematic chain is known as a serial mechanism, a serial kinematic chain. Okay. On the other hand, if there exist kinematic loops, or in other words, if I reconnect one of the links, one of the rigid bodies back to one of the earlier rigid bodies, I do not serially connect them, but also connect them back to one of the other rigid bodies earlier, then what you get is what is known as a parallel kinematic chain. Okay, a mechanism could comprise both serial as well as parallel chains. Okay, so why is it called parallel? The name parallel is misleading because it has nothing to do with parallel lines or such other geometric parallelism. It's called parallel because if you have such a loop, then if I move one of the rigid bodies in the loop, many others also end up moving. Okay, so that's why it's called as a parallel kinematic chain. Okay, so let me give an example. I mean, why one obvious question that we would get is, why do you have two kinds of kinematic chains? Actually, in terms of manipulation, if I have an end effector that I want to move, I can move it by using either serial kinematic chains or parallel kinematic chains. I can realize the kind of motion I want, its position and orientation changes that I want, using either of these two techniques. Okay, then that naturally brings up this question as to why there are these two different techniques. So to which I will provide an answer in a minute. In the meantime, if you guys have any questions, I can answer it.
So due to some network issues, I missed the part of kinematic chains. Could you briefly repeat it?
Okay. So the way in which you can interconnect rigid bodies and make chains out of them can be classified broadly as two kinds. One is you connect the first rigid body to the next rigid body to the third one, and so on and so forth, and you don't come back, you don't loop around and connect one of the later rigid bodies to the first rigid body. In other words, you don't create a kinematic loop. Okay, so that kind of a interconnection of serial interconnection of rigid bodies is called as a serial kinematic chain. Whereas if you have an interconnection, which you bring in an interconnection of one of the later rigid bodies with the first one by means of another joint, that is called as a parallel kinematic chain. So if you take a concrete example, let us say I have one revolute joint here that is connected, that is fixing this first rigid body to the ground, and another revolute joint and a third revolute joint, and so on. So I get a 3R serial manipulator, serial kinematic manipulator. So there are three revolute joints here. Now, when I change the first one, the other two will not change. They can be changed independent of the first one. So this is a serial kinematic chain. On the other hand, if you take the 4-bar mechanism, so you have the crank, the follower, and the connecting rod, and so on and so forth. So when I change one of these, the position, the orientation of one of these, rigid bodies, the other two also get affected. The other two cannot be changed independent of the first one, and that's because there's a loop, a kinematic loop that has been created here. If I treat the ground also as the fourth rigid body, then these four rigid bodies, have an interconnection where the the fourth rigid body is connected back to the first one by means of the first joint. Okay, so this is a parallel kinematic chain, that is a serial kinematic chain. Okay, so another example, let's take this guy itself. So I have three revolute joints and they're aligned along three different axes. So in principle, let us say I were to mount a camera on this, I can change the pointing direction of the camera anywhere in 3D. Okay, I have three Euler angles at my disposal here, and I can use that to point this camera in any direction. At the same time, you have never seen camera tripods use this kind of an architecture. On the other hand, what is often done for a camera is you have a tripod, as the name itself indicates, you have a platform that is connected to the ground by means of 3 prismatic joints, right? You have 3 telescopic arms which can be moved in and out, and you can change the length of the legs of these of the platform. Okay, and that also can be used to orient the camera in whichever direction you want. Now, between the two, you have never come across something like this. An orientation system which uses a serial kinematic chain, whereas you always see cameras mounted on tripod. So both of them are able to accomplish the same task. Okay, but you prefer one over another, not for reasons of what you can get in terms of position and orientation, but for other reasons that are related to stiffness and error and so on. So, for example, because all the 3 together are holding up this one stage, this configuration here results in a much higher stiffness for the overall structure compared to that one. You can imagine even intuitively that if I were to place something here, it's likely to sag because of these because of the elasticity, small elasticity that there might be for these intermediate bodies, or some springiness that may be, etc., etc. So you can therefore that you will get a stiffer structure if you use parallel kinematics versus serial kinematics. Likewise, if I have some error in positioning, that error propagates down the kinematic chain in the case of serial kinematics, because whatever error here there is at the first one will get carried forward to the second one and the third one, and whatever there is in the second one will get carried forward to the third one, and so on and so forth. Whereas, so error propagation becomes more easy, and therefore the positioning errors can become larger in case of serial kinematic chains compared to parallel kinematic chains. Here there is no such propagation of error. Okay, so there are therefore although from the point of view of achieving the desired pose for the end effector, either of them can potentially do the job. Often one prefers one over another for other reasons, for reasons of rigidity, for reasons of precision in positioning, etc., etc. Okay, so we have all these kinematic chains. One of the most important next aspects of these chains, in addition, after talking about joints and the kinds of chains, is a degree of freedom of a mechanism. So you have these serial or parallel kinematic chains, and they're connected by joints. So each of these joints constrain in the motion of these rigid bodies with respect to one another, and therefore they permit only certain kinds of motion to happen. And the kinds of motion that can happen is captured by this notion of the degree of freedom. Of a mechanism. It could be a serial kinematic mechanism or a parallel kinematic mechanism. Either way, you can define a degree of freedom for them. And the formal definition is that the number of independent joint variables that need to be specified to locate all parts of a mechanism. So this is the formal definition. Again, it's quite an concept. It is also representative of the number of motors that I can, independent motors that I can fix to this particular mechanism to drive it. Okay. Now there is a way to calculate the degrees of freedom of a mechanism that have been connected by a certain set of joints, certain types of joints, and you must have come across this in your undergrad. It's called Grubler's criterion. Okay, so in general, if you have n rigid bodies, okay, then each rigid body has 6 degrees of freedom. It can translate along 3 orthogonal axes and rotate about 3 orthogonal axes. So it has 6 degrees of freedom. So in general, n rigid bodies therefore will have 6n degrees of freedom. Okay. Now among these n rigid bodies, one of them will serve as the ground. Okay, one of them will be fixed. So therefore, I would remove the 6 degrees of freedom associated with that particular fixed rigid body, and this would be the number of degrees of freedom remaining for the mechanism, assuming that they are not connected to one another by the joints yet. Okay. Now from this 6n minus 6, each joint removes certain number of degrees of freedom. So if there are, each joint, let us say, has fi degrees of freedom. Okay, in case of where I represents the ith joint. Okay, so if the ith joint is a revolute joint, that number f will be 1. If the ith joint is a cylindrical joint, that number f will be 2, etc. So the number of degrees of freedom that are constrained on account of the existence of that particular joint will be the total number of degrees of freedom 6 minus the number of degrees of freedom that it is constraining. Okay, which is number of degrees of freedom of the joint itself, which is fi, and I need to sum this, okay, over all the joints that I might have. So if I have j joints, I sum this from 1 to j and subtract that number, which is the number of degrees of freedom that are constrained by the I'll just put this here, number of DOFs constrained by the joints. Okay, so this is the total number of degrees of freedom available if one of the links, one of the rigid bodies is fixed. Okay, so therefore this sum is, what is it equal to? It is 6n minus 6 minus this entire thing. I can remove 6 out. I can make this a 6j plus sigma fi. I goes from 1 to j. Okay, I can group this better. N minus j minus 1 plus sigma I equal to 1 to j fi. Okay, and this represents a total number of degrees of freedom of the mechanism. So if this is movement in 3D, this is what the expression would be. If many of the mechanisms that are designed are planar mechanisms, for example, your familiar 4-bar mechanism, whether it be in the form of a crank rocker or a slider crank or whatever, they're all planar mechanisms in the sense that the motion of these rigid bodies, the velocities are all confined to a plane. Okay, although the mechanism itself is a 3-dimensional one, the motion is confined to a plane. That's why they are called planar mechanisms. So for planar motion, you only need planar motion requires only 3 degrees of freedom: displacement along x, displacement along y, and rotation about the z axis. So if we are talking only of planar mechanisms, if I have n rigid bodies, instead of having 6n degrees of freedom, I will have 3n degrees of freedom. Okay, and one of the rigid bodies is fixed, I will remove 3 degrees of freedom associated with that, and then I will subtract from that the number of degrees of freedom that I would have for each of the joints, number of degrees of freedom constrained by each of the joints, equal to 1 to n, and therefore I would get the degrees of freedom for a planar mechanism to be 3 times n minus j minus 1 plus sigma fi. Okay, so this is the expression for a planar mechanism. And both these expressions are what are known as Grubler's criterion. I can calculate the number of degrees of freedom for that mechanism, for that interconnection of rigid bodies, if I'm given the kinds of joints that I have and the way in which they are connected, and the number of rigid bodies that I have. Okay, so let us take some examples to illustrate how you would use Grubler's criterion. Let us take that serial manipulator that we considered. So we had 1, 2, 3 3 revolute joints here, right? So if we take the first expression, this is a 3-dimensional thing. So if we take the first expression, I have how many joints? you should not forget that you should consider the ground also as one of the joints, one of the rigid bodies. So I have n equal to 4, okay, of which of course 1 is fixed, so 4 minus 1, okay, minus the number of joints I have is 3, okay, plus the sum of the degrees of freedom of each of the joints. So each of the joints has 1 degree of freedom, so 1. J goes from 1 to 3. Okay, so if you do the math here, I don't know what you get. So let us see, 6 times 4 minus 4 is 0 plus 3, which is 3 degrees of freedom. Okay, so this I have 3, I can attach 3 motors and independently control the orientation of the end effector. The position cannot be independently controlled. It is dependent on the joint angles of the 3 motors, of the 3 revolute joints. Okay, if on the other hand we arrange these 3 sticks differently, so and make a 4-bar mechanism out of it, so something like this, we have arranged it in this particular fashion, then it's a planar mechanism to start with. It's not a 3-dimensional mechanism, so we apply this, use this expression. We have 3. The number of rigid bodies that we are interconnecting is 4, including the ground. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, one of them is the ground, so it's completely arrested, minus 1. Okay, and then there are 4 revolute joints, so minus 4. Okay, the number of revolute joints, there is 4 of them, so J goes from 1 to 4, and each of them has 1 degree of freedom. So each of F1 is also 1, F2 is also 1, etc., etc. And if I add these up, what do I get? This is 3 times 4 minus 1 minus 4, which is minus 3, plus 4, which is 1 degree of freedom, and which makes perfect sense, right? I can only control one of the joint variables. I can control the, the input angle, the crank angle. The other angles automatically get fixed if I fix the crank angle. So it makes sense that we should have only 1 degree of freedom. Any questions about this analysis? Okay, there are no questions, so let us proceed further. While this expression is useful in general, I need to add a caveat. Okay, it's not, there are certain occasions where this gets violated, and these kinds of mechanisms where they get violated are what are known as over-constrained mechanisms. Okay, so over-constrained mechanisms are one where the degrees of freedom. Yeah, Subhadip Sahu has a question.
Yes, sir. Good morning.
Good
Sir,
morning.
I have a question that you have written the Fi. So Fi, how is it calculated? Means is it calculated by single link, or is it calculated by considering 2 link or something like that?
Fi is a property of the joint. Okay, in order to avoid double counting, you count it only for, you're not counting it for the link, you're counting it for the joint. Okay, each joint is assumed to remove 5 degrees of freedom or 4 degrees of freedom, depending on the number of degrees of freedom that the joint itself has. Okay, it's not connected with the number of links, it's connected with the number of joints.
Okay, sir.
Okay, so an important mechanism that was used in steam engines earlier on was, I think it is called a parallelogram mechanism or something. I don't remember the name of that. So there's one rigid body, and then that's connected to 3 cranks. Okay, so this rigid body therefore can rotate 3 wheels simultaneously at the same speed. Okay, so this was part of the mechanism that existed to drive steam engines. Okay, so if you apply Grubler's criterion here, this is a planar mechanism. How many rigid bodies do we have? We have this entire top rod as one rigid body, and then you have these 3 cranks. So that's 1 plus 3, 4 rigid bodies plus the ground, which is 5 rigid bodies. So n is 5. Okay, how many joints, how many joints do we have? We have 6 joints. Okay, so J, capital J is 6. Okay, so if you compute, and each of them are revolute joints, so Fi is equal to 1 for all I. Okay, for all I equal to 1 to J, 1 to 6. Okay, so the expression for the degree of freedom is that it's 6 times 5 minus 1 minus 6 plus sigma Fi, which is 6. Okay, sigma J I equal to 1 to 6. Okay, what do you get if you compute this? 5 minus 1 minus 6 is minus, no, I think I have made a mistake here somewhere. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, there are 5 joints, and then there are 6. J is 6. So
student, the ground we also consider as joint.
Correct. Ground is also considered a rigid body. So you have 5 rigid bodies. N is 5, right? So you have this is a planar mechanism. So this is 3. Sorry, not 6. Okay. So this is 3 times.
Yes, sir.
5 minus 1 minus 6 is minus 2. Okay. Plus this is 6. Okay. Which you get to be equal to 0. Okay. So it appears as though this has no degrees of freedom. I cannot move. This is a frame. Something with no degrees of freedom is called as a frame. It has a fixed structure. It cannot be a mechanism. It cannot move. Okay. But whereas we know that this can move, and the reason it is of this particular thing, all these 3 cranks have the exact same length, and therefore this behaves like a parallelogram, and that's what allows it to move. If, for example, one of these cranks had a larger length, okay, then this would become a frame. I will not be able to move this at all, and therefore this degree of freedom being 0 will be valid. So this is a special case where, on account of this unique geometry, namely that the 3 cranks have the exact same length, is it possible to move this. So this is an example of an over-constrained mechanism. Another example, which is far more mundane, is a door which is hinged at multiple locations. Okay, you have 3 or 4 or more hinges for a door, right? Have that many number of hinges. Let us say we consider this as a a 3-dimensional mechanism, just a rigid body, which is a door, connected to another rigid body, the wall, by means of this revolute joints. Okay, so 6 is the number of is the initial term that multiplies the expression, and the number of rigid bodies is 2, and of which 1 is fixed. So 2 minus 1 minus, let us say I have n or j hinges. Okay, 2 minus 1 minus j plus the number of degrees of freedom for each of them is 1. So plus j. This will be the expression. Let us plug in the value for j equal to 3, for instance. So I would get 6 times 2 minus 1 is 1. 1 minus 3 is minus 2, and this plus 3. So 6 times minus 2 is 12. Minus 12 plus 3, which is minus 9. It makes no sense. I get negative degrees of freedom for this particular thing. Okay, so what makes it click? It's only because all these 3 revolute joints have their axes aligned with respect to one another is rotation possible for this door. Grubler's criterion does not take that particular geometric uniqueness into account. So if this hinge, even the second hinge, forget about the third hinge, even the second hinge was at a different location, its axis was not aligned with the axis of the first hinge, then this door cannot move. If I were to put the second hinge here, the door cannot move. It becomes a frame. Okay, it's because of the special geometric arrangement that this motion is possible. Such mechanisms where this special geometry results in them possessing a non-zero degree of freedom, although Grubler's criterion predicts that they should not have any degree of freedom, they are called as over-constrained mechanisms. So I just wanted to point out, make this caveat before we go forward, before you start to use this notion of Grubler's, the concept of Grubler's criterion. So that brings us finally to the significance, having talked about some of the kinematic aspects of an interconnection of rigid bodies. I shall briefly talk about the significance of dynamics. See, all of these are about kinematics, right? So far I have talked only about interconnection of rigid bodies, the way you can interconnect them, and the degrees of freedom, etc., etc. Where does dynamics come in? Where does dynamics play a role? How does it? What is the significance of dynamics in the study of multi-body systems? So, the significance of dynamics, of course, is that if you have a multi-body system, sometimes there are forces that you can control, and there are forces that you cannot control. Okay, so no matter what you do, you cannot wish away gravity if you are operating on Earth. Okay, so therefore, even if there are forces that you can control, there will be other forces which will affect your interconnection of rigid bodies, and the way the rigid body moves or responds to those forces, in addition to the forces that you can yourself apply and control, are of importance to us. Okay, so effect of forces that we cannot control. Okay, that's one reason why study of dynamics is important. The second is, these forces, whether those we can control or those we cannot control, either of them, they result in stresses in the different rigid bodies. Of course, we talked about how rigid body is only a model for a solid body. A rigid body, no solid body is perfectly rigid. So when you have these stresses are dependent on the centrifugal forces and the Coriolis forces that these rigid bodies experience as they move relative to one another. And those stresses, therefore, can potentially break these solid objects. And therefore, it is important to understand dynamic stresses. Even though this course is devoted to study of rigid bodies, we acknowledge the fact that these motion of these rigid bodies would result in development of internal stresses. If the body was perfectly rigid, these stresses are meaningless. Okay, they will not deform and they will not break. But no body is ideally rigid, and therefore the dynamic stresses can potentially result in fracture. And that's why dynamic stresses, due to all the forces, need to be studied. Of course, this course will not talk about the second part of this problem, namely the resulting strains due to these forces. That is part of that to do that you have to bring in elasticity and so on. Here we are just talking of rigid bodies, but they still experience stresses, and we need to understand them so that when we bring in the elasticity, we know that the bodies are going to survive the kinds of stresses that they experience. And then the third is, if the interconnection of rigid bodies do not behave the way we expect them to behave, then we need to apply forces to correct for the for their trajectory or whatever else. Okay, their position or some such thing, position or velocity or whatever. And to correct for that, we need to have a good dynamic model for that interconnection of bodies. So feedback control, which is what we would use to correct for errors in positioning, etc., due to uncertainty about the model of the system or the forces, extraneous forces that we have not taken into account while modeling the system, etc., that requires you to have a good dynamic model for your system. Okay, feedback control requires a dynamic model for the design of the controller, for control design. So all these require you to directly compute the effect of forces on motion. Okay, so this comes under what is known as direct dynamics. So you apply forces, what is the resulting motion? That's called direct dynamics. The second kind, which is also very useful, is I know in many cases the kind of motion I want. So for example, I know if I have a robot which has to lift 1 kg and move it from point A to point B, I know how I want that robot to move from point A to point B. But to execute this motion, I have to apply appropriate kinds of joint torques. Okay, so I have to therefore, given the motion that is possible that I want to realize, I want to be able to compute the joint torques that can achieve that kind of motion. And this kind of computation also, of course, has to take into account the inertial effects and the Coriolis effects and so on of this interconnection of rigid bodies. And this is called as inverse dynamics. Okay. So in inverse dynamics helps us to compute the joint torques, joint forces or torques necessary to execute motion along a certain trajectory. I'll put execute the desired kind of motion. Okay, I'm sorry, my handwriting is not very good. I'll just read it out. Inverse dynamics helps you to compute the joint forces or torques necessary to execute a desired kind of motion. The second significance of inverse dynamics arises from the fact that once you know these joint forces and torques, it helps you choose the right kinds of motors or for each of those joints. So if you choose an actuator that cannot generate that kind of torque, you know that you will not be able to execute that kind of the desired kind of motion. And this is what is known as actuator sizing. So roughly what size of the actuator, what specifications for speed and torque that I need for my motor or for some other pneumatic actuator or whatever else, in order for me to move my robotic arm with a certain velocity along a certain trajectory while it is carrying a certain mass. All of that is possible if I am able to use inverse dynamics to compute what the maximum forces and torques generated are and what the maximum speeds necessary are, and confirm that whatever motor I pick is capable of generating those particular speeds and torques. Okay, so this is the read for inverse dynamics. So as I said, the significance of dynamics is mostly in connection with mechanisms, and these mechanisms, being rigid bodies having a certain mass, will experience centrifugal and Coriolis forces and so on, and therefore they could result in stresses which might break these links. The motion of these has to be understood well in order for us to know what an extraneous force over which we have no control can do to the system, and then we can use the models to compute the kinds of forces or torques we need to get the desired kind of motion, and to also choose the right kind of motor. So there are multiple reasons why we need to study why the dynamics of multi-body systems is significant. But if you look at all of these things, you get the feeling that these are necessary. These are important things that need to be taken care of, but they're not central to the operation of these multi-body systems. So to give an example, if you look at the swash plate that we considered in the first example, a swash plate, it is spinning about a certain axis. We found out the reaction forces. Yes, the reaction forces were useful, they were important, they helped us choose the bearings correctly, etc. But they were there. We were not making any use out of those reaction forces. Okay. Whereas in the second case of the reaction wheel, we used dynamics to we put the dynamics to a particular use. We accelerated the wheel or applied a torque on the wheel so that the object on which the wheel was connected could be rotated in the opposite direction. So there we put it to some meaningful use. Okay. Whereas in the case of the swash plate, it was necessary, but it was not a central aspect of the swash plate. The central aspect of the swash plate, as we saw, was its use in a helicopter, or its use as a engine or some such thing, as a some crank for a pump or some such thing. So likewise, for the most part, the role of dynamics is to compute these forces and torque so that the mechanism works as planned. It is not central to the operation of the mechanism. There are a few mechanisms, however, whose working itself depends on dynamics. Okay, there are a few of them. One of them, for example, is what is known as the Watt's flyball governor. You must have come across this in some other form, if not under this very particular name, governor. Okay, what this does here is there are two balls that are spinning about a certain axis, and there is a certain mechanism that connects these balls to the axis of spinning. Okay, and then there is a collar here. Okay, when this shaft spins faster, this ball experiences higher centrifugal force, so it will move farther away. And when these balls move farther away, then by virtue of the way they are connected to the collar moves up. Okay, and by a series of other mechanisms, you can convert this upward motion of the collar to a change in the angle of the throttle valve to the engine that is spinning this shaft. So you can use this fly ball mechanism to control the spinning speed of an engine, and this is called as a Watt's fly ball governor. Okay, it's called a governor because it governs the speed of the engine. Okay, so if the speed reduces, similarly, these balls will come closer to the axis of rotation because they are experiencing lesser centrifugal force, and that pulls down the sleeve. And when the sleeve pulls down by a series of mechanisms, you can translate that to an increase in the angle of the throttle and let in more fuel and speed up the engine. So this helps to regulate the speed of an engine. Okay, so this is one example of dynamics directly coming into play. The second example is in case of an IC engine. So if you remember, a 4-stroke engine has 4 strokes, right? One is inlet, the other is compression, the third is ignition, the fourth is exhaust. So how does compression happen? So when you have inlet and then there is compression, how does compression happen? The crank moves the piston towards the spark plug, thereby reducing the volume of the gas inside that cylinder bore. And that compression is facilitated by the non-zero inertia of the piston and the crankshaft, right, and the connecting rod. That non-zero inertia, that the piston has, is what allows it to compress the gas. So therefore there are examples where dynamics is central to the operation of a mechanism, but in most cases there's a mechanism which does some kinematic, which has a certain kinematic role. But to operate that mechanism effectively, we need to understand the dynamic forces and compensate for them. Okay, so that's as far as the significance of dynamics in study of multi-body systems is concerned. Now we shall move to the mathematics necessary for this study. So kinematics of multi-body systems. Okay, so we need to also improve the mathematical toolkit that we have at our disposal. So far we have invented a few things along the way. The vectors, the invention of vectors helped us in some way. Moving from vectors to matrices helped us in another way. Can be, therefore, would that machinery be adequate for analysis of multi-body systems, or do we need something more? So I am considering 2 rigid bodies that are connected by a certain joint here. Okay. Now, in the study of a single rigid body, we defined 2 coordinate frames. One was the inertial frame and the other was the body fixed frame. Here, there are multiple rigid bodies, and therefore, it makes sense for us to define as many body fixed frames as we have rigid bodies. Okay, so we have 1 frame, 2 frames. If we have n rigid bodies, we have n frames, because our Euler's equations take on a simple form when we write it in the body coordinates of that particular rigid body. Okay, so we have multiple rigid, multiple coordinate frames. The second difference compared to the tools that were necessary for study of single rigid bodies is that we talked about how the force experienced by a single rigid body is not connected with the offset between the center of that inertial frame and the frame attached to the rigid body. Right, that offset was not important, only the orientation difference was important, and that's why we needed only a rotation matrix to connect the the 2 coordinate frames. We assumed that their offset was 0 because it was irrelevant from the point of view of dynamics of a single rigid body. Whereas with multiple rigid bodies, on account of the fact that they are connected to one another, these connections impose constraint forces on one rigid body and prevent them from moving along the degrees of freedom where they are constrained. Okay, therefore, the offset between the two coordinate frames is also important. We cannot ignore the offset between them. Okay, that is the second main difference, and that results in certain problems in certain issues with representation, which we shall briefly talk about next. Okay, so let us consider, for example, this is a A frame. Okay, this is a B frame. I'm just considering two coordinate frames for the moment, just to highlight what extra information would come into play. Okay, let us say I have a point in the B frame, some point on the second rigid body. Okay, I need to represent it, let us say, with respect to the first rigid body, P represented in the A frame. How do I do that? I know what P represented in the B frame is. It is this particular vector. Okay, what is P represented in the A frame? It is that particular vector. This is P represented in the A frame. This is P represented in the B frame. Do you guys agree with me? These two vectors don't have the same length, right? So what is the expression for P represented in the A frame given P represented in the B frame? So I know that this vector, the vector starting with the origin of the A frame and going to that point P, is a summation of two vectors. The vector starting at the origin of the second frame and going to the point P, plus the vector starting from the origin of the A frame and going to the origin of the second frame. So this vector plus that vector gives me the overall vector, which is the representation of the point P in the A coordinate system. So I would therefore write that the representation of that point P in the A coordinate system is a representation of that point P in the B coordinate system multiplied with the rotation matrix connecting the representations differences between B and A. So R of B with respect to A. This is something that was clear to you. This is what you would have if there is no offset in the origins between these two coordinate frames. But because there is an offset, I will have a second term, which is the position vector of the origin of the B frame, which I indicate as O subscript B, represented in the A coordinate system. Okay, so this is going to be the expression relating the position of a point P represented in the A frame with respect to the and its representation in the B frame. Okay, earlier also I need to remind you that such an offset could have existed even in case of analysis of a single rigid body. There was probably an offset between the inertial frame's origin and the body frame's origin, but the forces which are dependent on velocity and acceleration and so on did not depend on that offset. Therefore, we did not consider that at all when we were writing down the equations. Whereas here, on account of this interconnection of rigid bodies, the forces will depend on the offset, and therefore we have to take that into account. Now, this equation does not look as neat as the equation that we used earlier. Okay. Remember how we progressed in this course? We initially started with vectors, with unit vector notation, and discovered that if you have to represent coordinate, the relative orientations between two coordinate systems, we need to remember 9 numbers, right? If you were to stick to unit vector notation. Unit vector notation itself was very useful. We cannot ignore that because it helped us write down expressions for cross product, etc., in a very compact manner. 3 equations could get reduced to 1 equation, and the cross product notation also could helped us simplify the appearance of the expressions. So all the time we were seeking simplicity in the appearance of equations. Okay, so we got to 2 coordinate frames. We got rid of unit vectors and instead shifted base to matrices. We instead decided to represent the same vectors, not using x cap, y cap, j cap notation, but instead by means of a column matrix, and we call that itself as the column vector. That allowed us to package away those 9 numbers that relate the orientation difference between 2 frames, the direction cosines. Those were replaced by a single symbol, and that was this symbol, the rotation matrix. Okay. Now we are at a new juncture where even with this new symbol, the expression, the relationship between the points represented in the A frame and the B frame do not look adequately simple. Okay, I have two symbols that I need to remember now in order to relate the A frame to the B frame. Okay, and I seek further simplicity in the representation of that point P, in the A frame to the B frame in the presence of this offset between the origins of the two frames. Okay, so it is with that intention that we would proceed next. Any questions about the motivation for this? Okay, so how do we do it? How do we package away the complexity, that slightly added complexity that has come about because of the existence of this offset? So we can write PA as, by using vector matrix notation itself, RAB with, so what is this OAB? It's a 3x1 column vector, right? And RAB is a 3x3 matrix. So I can put them together, juxtapose them, okay, and have this term here, and this will therefore be a 3x4. It has 3 rows and 4 columns, okay, matrix times PB. I can do this, right? So PB comma 1. So that PA is RAB PB plus 1 times OAB. I can do this. Okay. Now, what has happened is that I can call this new thing by a new name and therefore claim that I have packaged away the complexity. But there is a small problem. On the right hand side, that vector that was representing position before was a 3x1 vector, Px, Py, Pz in the B frame. But now I have to add this extra one, I have to augment that vector with an extra unity to make it a 4x1 vector in order for me to get the simplicity that I am looking for. Okay. Now there is this problem that on the right hand side, the position vector in the A frame continues to be a 3x1 vector, whereas on the left hand side it has been made a 4x1 vector in the interest of simplicity. And this, position vector is a position vector whether it's in the B frame or the A frame. I don't like the fact that it's a 3x1 vector in one frame and a 4x1 vector in another frame. So what do I do? For the sake of uniformity in representation, I also augment a unity in the representation of the position vector in the A frame and make it PA comma 1. So I put one more row at the bottom and make this also a 4x1 vector. And then if that is the case, I will have RAB, R of B with respect to A, and then O of B with respect to A as the top two terms. And this 1 here should not multiply PB at all, right? I should just get 1 equal to 1 as the last equation. And therefore, I make this 1 PB 1. Okay. So now I have a new matrix, okay, which relates this augmented position vector in the A frame to the augmented position vector in the B frame. This 1 here remains the same. It's a dummy. Okay. It has been introduced only for me to enable packaging away the complexity that has been brought in because of the offset between the two coordinate systems. So therefore, I have brought that in. And now both these position vectors are no longer 3x1 vectors, but now they are both 4x1 vectors. That's great. So that unhappiness has gone away. And now I have a single matrix which contains information about position as well as a position offset as well as orientation offset. And this matrix is called as T of B relative to A. And this is called as a homogeneous transformation matrix. T of B relative to A is homogeneous transformation matrix. Okay. So now I can write, if I view my position vector as a 4x1 vector, maybe I will represent it by a slightly different symbol. So some double parallel lines for representing that stick of that P. P of A is equal to T of B relative to A, P of B. P represented in the B coordinate system. Okay. Now you look at this expression. This is similar to the rotation matrix that we used earlier to represent the orientation, to represent a vector P in the B coordinate frame back in the A coordinate system. And A very similar relationship exists now. Like the way the rotation matrix packaged away and contained information about the orientation difference between A and B coordinate systems, this homogeneous transformation matrix packages away the information about not only orientation difference, but also the position difference. And this is a 4x4 matrix. Okay, so this, well, I was about to go ahead and derive a couple of properties of the homogeneous transformation matrix. I will do only one of them and stop because it's almost past time. So if I have, for example, a third coordinate system, the C coordinate system, I would have that the position vector of of a point P represented in the C coordinate system, which is shown that way, is related to the position vector in the B coordinate system with through the transformation matrix T of C relative to B. Okay. Likewise, the position vector of the representation of the point P in the B frame is related to its representation in the A frame through this particular transformation matrix. So if I have an offset between the A frames and the C frames, okay, the two would by definition be related by a transformation matrix C of T of C relative to A, and from these two expressions I see that P of A is equal to T of P relative to A times T of C relative to B times P of C. And comparing this equation and that equation, the two underlined equations, I conclude that T of B relative to A times T of C relative to B is equal to T of C relative to A. This is analogous to the rotation matrix expression that we wrote, namely R of C relative to A was equal to R of B relative to A times R of C relative to B. Exactly analogous to that. Okay. How we use this and what other properties does this homogeneous transformation matrix have, we will take a look at in the next class. Thank you. If you have any questions, you can ask. Okay, there seem to be no questions, so we will stop the class at this point. I wish to announce again, perhaps some of them have already left, that we would have this special class on Saturday around 3:30 p.m. I sent an email also about that. Thank you.